We're in the information age, but facts are in short supply. Reject the noise, ask bold questions, and pursue the truth with FBI whistleblowers and founding suspendables Garrett O'Boyle and Steve Friend. This is the American Radicals Podcast.
It is the American Radicals Podcast on a Thursday, 10:30, coming to you live on rumble.com/amradpod and also on the YouTube at the American Radicals Podcast. We come to you every Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday, 10:30, and as well as on the iTunes and the Spotify and the iHeart, the audio format there, which will drop after we get done broadcasting the video format today. So if you haven't already, make sure you give us a nice like, a share, a follow, a subscribe, do all the things, tell a friend or 12. We're trying to trick those algorithms into sharing the American Radicals Podcast with as wide an audience as possible, because it is, after all, a hobbyist podcast that should be shared as wide as possible. And I have to issue my disclaimer, as I want to do now, that this is in fact a hobbyist podcast. I am an American citizen expressing my First Amendment right to share my perspectives on things in the news, open source information, current events, definitely under no circumstances representing any particular agency, arm, department, bureau of the federal government of the United States of America. I don't know if you can hear it, but the voice, the RFK Jr., if you're a longtime listener to the American Radicals Podcast, it might be coming on me here. I'm getting a little bit weak. The allergies are here. So I'm grateful today because we're actually going to have a guest with us today, Professor Nicholas Giordano, who is the purveyor of the PAS Report podcast. He's going to get on in a moment and talk to us about the deep state's threat to Congress and the American people. We're going to have a nice kind of brainstorm session, I think. Typically, when I do an interview, we don't have guests very often. I'm very prepared. If it's an author, I've read the book. I've got my bullet points that I want to talk about. But I really wanted to get Nick on because he's been gracious enough to have me on his podcast. We have a mutual acquaintance, George Hill. George has been a guest on the American Radicals Podcast over the years multiple times. He likes to blackpill everybody and particularly scare my mom whenever she's watching with the threats that are out there. But Nick's got a really unique perspective, and I wanted to share it. And maybe we can hit some of the high points of his podcast, but definitely want to route you over there as well. And we'll get to all that in a minute. But let's thank the underwriting sponsor of the program, and then we'll kick things off. The underwriting sponsor, which is kind of an affiliate. We don't take any money. We just support American businesses here on this hobbyist podcast. And today, that's the M-Clip Company. Everybody should go to m-clip.com. m-clip.com. And when you do, you can use the promo code SUSPENDABLE, SUSPENDABLE, to get 10% off of these luxury goods, money clips, lifetime guarantee, sleek looking, metallic, leatherware. You got some cufflinks available as well. If you're a baseball fan, I know we just got done with the World Series, but your favorite team, you can get that put onto your money clip. It will not break the bank. Like I said, a lifetime guarantee, family-owned business, been in business for more than 2 decades. And if you want to rock the Suspendables line, you can do that as well, which has our badge and our logo and our emblem, all of it available to you. 10% off, m-clip.com. The promo code is Suspendable. So without further ado, I want to bring on the professor, Nicholas Giordano, who, as I said, he was gracious enough to have me on his program multiple times. Always like to kind of talk about what I love to talk about, federal law enforcement, national security. Nick, thanks for making the time for me today. Thanks for actually maybe doing some heavy lifting, as the vocal voice is, the fry is coming in. I can feel it. I have those seasonal allergies. I sound like RFK Jr. for about 4 to 5 days, twice a year. And I think it's finally hit me here in November. But I wanted to give you a chance actually to introduce yourself to the audience and let them know what you're offering and what your bona fides. Can you kind of give us like a 30,000-foot view?
Sure, and thanks for having me on. Thankfully, I don't have the seasonal allergies, but I do sympathize with you because my child does. In any event, I've been in the political science arena for the last 20 years, inside a classroom, teaching the American youth about the founding fathers and how our founding fathers wanted limited government. And then I decided to host a podcast. It's a crazy thing, but I got into the podcasting industry. And we talk about things like limited government, the idea of fiscal responsibility, issues that the American people care about, but more importantly, delve into the topics outside of a 2.5 to 3 minute sound clip that you see on the news. So everyone could go to PAS Report, check it out, pasreport.com, or they can follow me on social media at PAS Report. And I do have several years in the Homeland Security emergency management arena. So that's what differentiates me from most academics. I actually have real world experience and understand how things work from a realistic point of view as opposed to the theoretical point of view.
All right. So, what kind of inspired me to invite you on today was our mutual acquaintance, George Hill. We're in a group chat, you and George and me, and he threw out your episode from earlier this week, November 3rd. And it was a conversation. I mean, it's entitled "The Deep State's Attack on the American People and the Congress," but really, you sort of centered on what's my baby, and that is weaponized federal law enforcement, particularly the FBI. And you actually laid out towards the end of the podcast some of the potential resolutions. But I want to hit you cold with sort of a speculation. Let's Can we exist in a mutually exclusive space to start off? And I want to get your feedback on this, where I present one of two options, and let's not let perfect be the enemy of good. Now, I've, for the last 3+ years, been talking about problems that exist in the FBI and the DOJ and in counterterrorism matters. Let's say that you have two options if we installed you as the dictator in chief. Option one, we could break it all into 1,000 pieces and scatter it to the wind. No federal law enforcement apparatus whatsoever, and rely on a robust local and state authorities to kind of pick up the slack. Second option, we could fully fund, as it currently is, the apparatuses that we have in the federal government, knowing full and well that they are not any evidence in dispute. There's no controversy that those very agencies and departments engaged in things like Crossfire Hurricane, the Hunter Biden laptop cover up, the recent revelations about Arctic frost, where they used a predicated investigation to investigate 20% of the Republican caucus in the United States Senate. I mean, those are things that we know, and we just give it the funding that it's had before. If you had one of those two options, what would you opt for?
Well, first of all, government and perfection do not belong in the same sentence together because there's never any perfection there. And I would actually choose option one. I mean, if we look at it, the entire national security apparatus was built in the 1900s and towards the mid 1900s. The reality is, America survived long before we had this huge federal bureaucracy that we see today. And America saw its greatest growth without the federal bureaucracy. The greatest expansion in American history occurred throughout the 1800s and the early 1900s. And when we examine this idea that the federal government has to be responsible for anything and everything, it's just illogical. I mean, I believe the number is 90+% of crime are state crimes. They're not federal crimes. They're state and local crimes, and therefore state and local police departments are fully capable of handling those issues on their own. In fact, when we look at many of the arrests that come out of the federal government, well, a lot of times it's the local governments, the local police forces, the local district attorneys that are actually leading, and the FBI swoops in at the end to take credit and say, hey, look at what we were involved in. So, yes, I think this country would get along just fine if we got rid of the law enforcement apparatus on the federal level. It would be nice to see something like that happen. I don't believe it will happen, but it certainly doesn't mean that if the federal apparatus didn't exist the way it currently is structured, that the United States ceases to exist tomorrow. In fact, I think quite the contrary is opposite. The country was just fine before we saw the major expansions. And in 2003, obviously, with Homeland Security, that added an entirely new level of bureaucracy, an entire new layer of federal law enforcement and intel services. And what have they really done? What have they actually achieved? It could be debated whether or not they achieved anything. And yet we have billions upon billions of dollars going to this apparatus that continually abuses its power.
I think it's beyond any sort of dispute. It would be objectively better, not perfect, but I think you can't argue that it would be better to not have these agencies that you know full and well have engaged in that sort of activity. And that would logically necessitate a conversation about, well, why wouldn't you do the objectively better thing? right? So if you were to actually zero those out and dissolve the entities entirely, and then I don't know, reconstitute in a fashion, I think that that will get you more close to a idea of perfection, which is unattainable. But I think that that's a reasonable thing in perspective to have, especially in light of how we are currently existing in this government shutdown era, where the Republicans are big mad and they want to go to the lectern and talk about how this is out of control and how dare they spy on me, let alone how many of them actually voted to reauthorize FISA without a warrant requirement, and get their fundraising up, get their moment on cable news tonight, and then pound the lectern with all that emotion. And how many of them are willing to then go right back to reauthorizing the government to open with a continuing resolution, which the Republican conservative opening negotiation point is we want to have all the spending that we had under Joe Biden and reopen the government with all of these agencies that just did this to us.
Yeah, I mean, that's the stupidity of Congress today, but it's not just the stupidity of Congress, it's the stupidity of the American people. I mean, the founding fathers warned us time and time again that they wanted to create this idea of self-government, limited government. They understood quite well that as the federal bureaucracy, the central government continually expands, the chances for the abuses of power grow greater and greater. And ultimately, at the end of the day, when everything is said and done, you turn around, how much freedom do you really have to exercise your liberties? So the founding fathers warned us about this. We've had many presidents throughout the years warn us about this, including, Dwight D. Eisenhower. And yet all those warnings are completely ignored. And the federal bureaucracy has made it as if they cease to exist. The country ceases to exist. The truth of the matter is, America is not our government, and our government is not America. They're two totally separate things, and people need to recognize that. Now, as far as Congress goes, something that you pointed out that's extremely important is the fact that you had Congressman Devin Nunes come out with a scathing report with all the evidence of how FISA was constantly being abused routinely. We got information from the courts that, what was it, over 200,000 FISA applications per year were being manipulated to get some of these warrants. And yet Republicans just willy-nilly just, all right, well, we'll keep FISA going. Let's vote to reauthorize it after it was used against them. And we've seen this pattern before where the bureaucracy will target members of Congress, ordinary Americans. They'll target Republicans. They'll target conservatives. And yet nobody does anything about it. And it gets quite disheartening when you look at the ones that have the power of oversight, the ones that have the power to rein in all these out of control agencies. It's discerning that none of them really take it seriously. They'll go on television, they'll create the sound bites, they'll give press conferences, they're going to flash their rages and anger and talk about how the bureaucracy is thoroughly corrupt. And yet they don't do anything to change it, to reform it, to make sure that something like this never occurs again. And the scary part is that it's not just within recent years. A lot of people think the abuses just came about. No, these abuses have been happening for quite a long time. And it's not just limited to the FBI, right? If we go all the way back to 2007, the NSA started the prison program and capturing the metadata of every single American. If we go to 2012, we saw the IRS was targeting Tea Party groups. If we go back to 2014, the Central Intelligence Agency was literally monitoring sitting members of the United States Senate Intelligence Committees, monitoring their communications. This was when John Brennan was in charge of the CIA, and he was targeting both Democrats and Republicans and their staffers in the Senate Intelligence Committee. And again, the Republicans and Democrats came out and feigned outrage when that was revealed to the American public, and yet they didn't do a damn thing to stop it. We saw the whole Crossfire Hurricane incident where you had members of the bureaucracy collude with the Hillary Clinton campaign, collude with all the different intel agencies, and they wanted to destroy a presidential candidate. It wasn't up to the American people to decide and elect who they wanted to lead the United States of America. It was these self-anointed guardians of democracy that think they are holier than thou that get to determine it. It's why they created the quote unquote insurance policy. And then when President Trump was elected, Well, we saw that same FBI target his staff members, target the investigation into him, tried to move towards impeachment. You know, it was helped with the leaking of the phone call with Vladimir Zelensky. And we saw that routinely the FBI, the CIA, the NSA undermine the president of the United States. Now, according to all my studies in American politics, government, and history, the founding fathers never intended a bureaucracy to be more powerful than duly elected members of the United States House of Representatives, the United States Senate, or the executive branch with the President of the United States. They wanted a bureaucracy to be subservient to them, but that's not what happened. We could look at the ICOP program done through the U.S. Postal Service, right? An agency that's created, a government corporation created to deliver our mail. And as if postal inspectors didn't have enough on their hands trying to look into mail fraud, because that's what they're supposed to investigate, they decide they're going to monitor social media and what people are posting out there, and they're going to flag those posts for the Department of Justice and Homeland Security. You had Homeland Security stand up the Stanford Election Integrity Project. This was a massive censorship operation where if people were posting things that went against government narratives in regard to the coronavirus or the 2020 elections, their posts would be censored. They would reach out to the social media companies. They made it as if it was Stanford University and I think the University of Washington were the ones flagging these posts. No, it was a DHS stood up operation. It was the Department of Homeland Security that was using the universities in this unholy alliance that was pushing for this censorship. And I could go on and on with the abuses, the parents and the school DOJ school board memo. You have the traditional Catholics. We see these abuses routinely and nothing ever gets done about them. What good are elected representatives when they're not going to exercise their power to rein this bureaucracy in?
So, what could possibly be the motivation for elected officials? And now that they're the victims of it, you would think they'd be extra motivated. But you do an excellent job of laying out all the historical train of abuses that we've had within the last decade and a half, maybe 2 decades. I mean, I guess you could stretch it to quarter century because after September 11th occurs, that's when we sort of transition into this different perspective on national security, where we're no longer relying on the government to be looking outward at threats. It becomes looking inward, and no longer are we going to be existing in a world where we have liberty and which has a sense of danger attached to it. Some things are just not avoidable, and the job of law enforcement is to investigate violations of law after. We can't do pre-crime, but instead we have a mentality of no American can ever die again at the hands of a terrorist. Ergo, you have to give up your liberty and rely on the government in order to do pre-crime, which it's not really good at doing. But why are these guys who are aspiring to high office and existing there, what's the motivation for them to say, all right, we'll just reauthorize it? Why wouldn't they actually pull the trigger on this?
Well, there's a few reasons, but before that, let's look at it. In free societies, there's risks. Free societies carry risks. If you want a society where there is minimal risk, where most of the risks are mitigated, then go to North Korea. North Korea is ruled with an iron fist. You're not going to find school shootings. You're not going to find murders. There's not going to be rapes unless it's the government doing these things. So what happened after 9/11 was largely predictable. At the time, I was a senior in college. I wrote an entire paper once the Patriot Act was passed about the threat that it represents to our liberty, how Americans were being foolish with this illusion of security that the Patriot Act is going to bring us, and how it's only a matter of time before the power is granted to the government. Maybe some were pushing it for good intent. I don't think they all had bad intentions, but it's only a matter of time before those powers are used against the American people, despite us being promised that it was only going to target Al Qaeda and terrorist organizations. Now, getting to the politicians themselves, why do they allow this to happen? I think there's all different types of politicians that exist in Congress. So, one of the things I do believe that cannot be dismissed is what Senator Schumer said shortly after Trump was elected in his first term. He was being interviewed by Rachel Maddow, and she asked him about Trump's attacks on the intelligence community. And Senator Chuck Schumer's response was actually frightening for someone like myself. It was terrifying. He said, he's being really stupid and he needs to stop because these intelligence agencies have, quote, 6 ways from Sunday to get. within, here's a senior leader within the United States Senate warning the president of the United States not to attack the intelligence community because the intelligence community will fight back. So I think there are those in Congress that are afraid of what the intel law enforcement communities may do to them if they speak out against them. Then I believe that you have the members of Congress that want the bureaucracy to have this power, right? Both Democrats and Republicans. Democrats look at it and say, well, it's wonderful. They're targeting our political opponents. It's great. We could ally ourselves with them. Republicans, on the other hand, are saying, well, once we get in power, then we get to use these intelligence and law enforcement components the way that we see fit. They love government power. And so it's a way to keep them in power. And then I think that you have a third class that looks at it from a funding perspective. You know, if they lose out on federal funding, if we begin to cut these departments and agencies, well, how is their local jurisdiction going to be affected? How much money, how many grants are going to be cut off from these local jurisdictions? So they look at it from the financial perspective. And then you have the few good people that actually do want to do something about it, yet they don't really introduce any bills to cut off the bureaucracy, cut the snake. And that's a little bizarre to me.
And I also think that they really, really like having congressional hearings that don't go anywhere. I mean, I've kind of been on record saying, let's just take the most vile person. Let's take Nancy Pelosi and put the lasso of truth around her, Wonder Woman style, and ask her, do you really want to get rid of guns? And she would tell you no, because she's able to have hearings about it and send out fundraising and have rallies. And that is able to motivate people to keep sending her back to office on the promise that she's going to get rid of guns. But it's just too damn lucrative for her to actually achieve that. So I think that they use the processes, the protocols, in order to have this fake outrage, in order to just personally enrich themselves.
Well, that's a great point. And, you know, there's one aspect of me that loves public hearings. I think that a transparent government is essential, that the public should be able to get to see what's going on in the questioning. But let's be realistic here. Actually, more stuff gets done in closed door hearings than the public hearings. Why? Because the public hearings are all about showboating. First of all, many of the questions are repetitive. So rather than members of Congress actually come up with a game plan to truly pin down a bureaucrat and to truly get answers, they ask the same questions and they get the same evasive answers. That's number one. Number two, in most cases, you'll have House members or Senate members, depending on where the committee hearing is happening, that get 5 to 6 minutes to speak. Notice they speak for about 5.5 minutes and only let the witness testify for about 30 seconds. And they keep on routinely interrupting the witness. And because it's not about getting answers, it's about getting that moment that you could put in a clip that could go viral on social media, getting that moment that will be beamed out on the major media networks so that you get the attention. And I think you're 100% correct about that. And listen, I mean, I understand politics. William Shakespeare said all politics is theater. It's nothing but a show, and that's true. But at the same time, the gross abuses of power are something that we can't ignore. And unfortunately, when we have people like the James Comeys, the John Brennans, the James Clappers of the world, these are trained operatives, right? These are people that know how to weasel out of questioning. These are people that can evade Congress really well because they have no regard or respect for Congress. When you listen to James Comey speak, he will constantly say in his testimony, well, that's not the way I recall it. I don't remember it that way. Well, I don't understand your questioning. He knows how to evade the questions that are being asked. And I think that Republicans and Democrats, they believe they're a lot smarter than the bureaucrats, but the actual opposite is true.
Now, we're going to have wailing and gnashing of teeth, and we're going to have the hearings about Arctic frost, because that's the big one right now that's in the news. That's going to get you lots of clicks on social media. So the Republicans are going to make hay while sun's shining. I want to see if your perspective on this is kind of where mine is at, where they're focusing on if they were actually truly interested in exposing the problems with it. It's not that this happened, and that's bad. I'm not saying that is acceptable. The problem for me for an Arctic frost, as I've hammered on this program and as wide as I possibly can, was that it was legal. Everything that happened with Arctic frost, which was Jack Smith's investigation into Donald Trump and seemingly everybody who's ever pulled a lever for a Republican or an elected official himself, the dragnet keeps getting wider and wider, and doing Oppo research effectively under the color of law. It was a predicated investigation, which means that there's information or an allegation of a potential violation of federal law. And the FBI, the DOJ, they followed every single protocol, every jot and tittle that's ever been there. They made sure that they were extremely buttoned up on it. They followed the Attorney General guidelines for domestic investigations. They followed the Domestic Investigations Operations Guide, guidance that came from Bill Barr multiple years ago. My concern is that it goes back to even a nice comparison to the Mar-a-Lago search warrant. That was completely legal. That the action itself is not necessarily the problem. It's that the people were willing to do it. Now, Nick, if you had an unpaid parking ticket and a bench warrant was issued for your arrest, it would be legal for me to send a SWAT team to your house, but wholly inappropriate. That's the wrong tool for that. It's a personnel matter. It's supposed to be people who are vetted as having fidelity to their oath to the Constitution, bravery to look around and say, hey, are we becoming the bad guy? Are what we doing violative of our ethics and morals, and having some modicum of integrity? And instead, they were good Germans, i.e. good Americans, who put their head down, just followed orders and said, well, a judge signed off on it, so I guess it's okay.
Well, I actually think that many within the bureaucracy that engaged in something like an Operation Arctic Frost believe they are the good guys still. That's the scary part. These are people that are not driven by fidelity of the law. These are people that are not mission oriented. These are people that put their ideology above all else. And I think there are a few that maybe had questions about this. However, they didn't speak up, they didn't speak out, and they went along with it because they didn't want to cause waves in the bureaucracy. They didn't want to end up like you, my friend. And we know how whistleblowers are treated. And so they just go along to get along. Plus, I understand the concept. I mean, I have two kids myself, I have mouths to feed, and I have to take care of my children. And so people are very worried about their livelihood is going to be put at risk if they do stand up and push back against their superior officers. But I think that you hit on something that's so important. This was legally justified. I mean, the FBI, and again, the people within the FBI and the CIA and other agencies, they're not stupid. They cover their tracks, and it's very easy to launch investigations. It's become easier and easier to launch investigations. All we have to do, just go back and look at the National Strategy for Countering Domestic Terrorism that talk about potential domestic terrorists, and the predicate is going to be if they engage in anti-government sentiment or anti-authority sentiment. They don't define what anti-government sentiment and anti-authority sentiment is. And basically, any criticism of government can be deemed anti-government sentiment. Any questioning of policies throughout the coronavirus, I constantly push back against policies. I constantly call them authoritarian. I said legislative bodies didn't pass any laws. There was no debates. These are governors using their unilateral decrees. I mean, what's the difference? When it comes to authoritarianism, it's one in a handful of people making decisions. And that's exactly what happened. Well, am I expressing anti-authority sentiment where now I could be investigated because I may be a potential domestic violent extremist? And I think that that's where Congress has failed dramatically. They gave statutory authority to enforce laws, but now the predicate for investigations has become so loose that you could basically justify any type of investigation as they see fit. They could justify monitoring my classroom, investigating me, because in the classroom, well, I criticize government and I criticize policies. Therefore, I may be a domestic violent extremist myself, or according to the national strategy, I may incite others to do something against the government because of what I'm speaking about. Well, that's what's going on in Britain. And many want to bring that British style here to the United States where you could be charged for the things that you say. The whole point of free speech is to question government and its policies. That's the beauty of the United States. And the second you stop asking these questions, the second you stop pressing the government out of fear that you're going to be targeted, they win. That's you don't have a free society anymore at that point. And we are witnessing that the First Amendment has been crushed by many within the government apparatus, within the bureaucracy.
We're doing the language game that is incredibly problematic. And people think I'm pedantic because I point out language, but it's incredibly important. We're dealing with federal entities that are
Well,
concerned with.
Steve, I just want to ask you, I just want to get your thoughts on this. So, when you have a document, I've written plenty of government documents before when I was in emergency management. When you have a government document like the National Strategy for Countering Domestic Terrorism, how many eyeballs are on that document before it actually gets approved to be released?
Dozens.
Dozens.
Dozens of eyeballs are on that.
So it's not a mistake when they don't define the terminology they use, the words they're using. It's not a mistake when they keep things vague. Understand, and the audience needs to understand that government bureaucrats are actually wordsmiths. Okay.
And that's why they use words like threat. I mean, the comparison I have is the FEMA professionals that were going down, and when the hurricane hit Western North Carolina, and the story came out just before the election last year that they weren't going to houses that had like MAGA flags or Donald Trump is my president signs because they felt that it was hostile. Well, it's a pretty vague term. We have threats, and then we have extremism. Well, extremism is kind of up to subjectivity, right? I mean, if you are like me and you get up early in the morning and go run for lots of miles, that's pretty extreme when you could just lay in bed and relax. So it's those words that are where the gray area is that they play, and then they're able to craft a narrative and then put out these intelligence products, which are laundered through the law enforcement apparatus, and then drive the mission forward because they say, well, our intelligence analysts are reporting back to us. Meanwhile, it's completely up to their subjective opinion as to what the problems are. And that's how you wind up with the new one, which is the nihilistic violent extremism, which seems problematic because nihilism means you have no ideology, and terrorists are sort of motivated by an ideology. So now you have somebody without ideas and they're extreme. And maybe we could use some artificial intelligence like Overwatch software that puts bots into chats and gets people to engage with their worst ideas and encourages them through either the artificial intelligence, confidential human sources, eventually undercovers, to agree to go do the worst idea that they were never predisposed or capable of carrying out. And then we have our terrorist. And then that entire playbook could be applied to whoever we want. I mean, it could be for political reasons, could be for bureaucratic reasons, because we just need to get our numbers. But to me, it's not really straining credulity to envision a time when we have a president, American psycho lookalike Gavin Newsom in charge. And they say, and I do enough public speaking events where it could be 36 people or it could be 1,000 people. I always have at least one crazy. Always one crazy person who's talking to me about how the aliens put things into their head. And then that person is vulnerable. They get encouraged to go do something, and they're now affiliated with a group that has ordinarily constitutionally abiding people. People are there for their First Amendment. I don't even care what their perspectives are. They're engaging in legal activity. But we can paint with a broad brush that group because we're able to encourage the worst crazy person to do their worst ideas. And now, because that group will be determined to be a domestic terrorist organization, like a Turning Points USA. 60,000 people there. Do you think they got a couple crazies? Yes. We get them to go do something, and now that's a domestic terrorist organization. And have you ever donated to TP USA? Have you ever worn their merchandise? Because now you've provided material support to a terrorist organization.
Yeah, and I think that's the concerning thing. I mean, let's look at it. There's a lot of mentally unhinged people out there. We've seen it get worse and worse in the United States. And here's an interesting dynamic. So you have traditional Catholics that were flagged as potential domestic violent extremists because they believe in two genders, they believe that a baby should have a chance at life, and they may want to hear a mass in Latin. And so they may be a domestic threat. Yet a study came out last year prior to 9/11 where 30% of those between the ages of 16 to 29 years old believe Osama bin Laden was a force for good in the world. They believe that Osama bin Laden had the right ideas. Now, do I look at that 30% and say, oh, they're going to start conducting terror attacks on the United States and they're going to join Al Qaeda? No, they don't. But you never heard of a threat when 30% of young people actually support bin Laden. When I see signs, queers for Palestine, I mean, I can't help but laugh, but nobody looks at them as if they're a terrorist threat. We look at them, maybe they're dumb, but they're not really a threat. And I think that's a good point. You could get anyone to do whatever you want in a way. I mean, understand that agents, many of them are trained to manipulate people. I mean, that's the basis of it. And if you look at a lot of, and I know obviously you speak about it all the time, you look at a lot of FBI press releases. I'm sorry, the 35-year-old loser that's been sitting in their parents' basement, that's been playing video games all day long, doesn't really have a job. They're not going to become some explosive expert mastermind that's going to go out and conduct an attack. The only reason they started engaging in that conversation in the first place was because they were in a chat room where someone was posting things and they said, yeah, I agree. And then, feds come in and they start their investigation. And, oh, look, we could get them to try and buy explosives and then we'll arrest them and say it's a major terrorist mastermind over here. No, terror masterminds are like the blind sheikh, Rahman, that wanted to blow up the Midtown Tunnel, Holland Tunnel, Lincoln Tunnel, Throgs Neck Bridge, George Washington. That's a terrorist. Okay, those are people that represent real threats. The real threats are those that were in the Taliban, that got training on the battleground, and yet they were just brought into this country under a refugee status when we pulled out of Afghanistan. Those are real threats that exist. A Catholic that wants to hear Mass in Latin, a parent complaining at a school board meeting about what their child is learning, those are not threatening people. But if you make it as if they're threats, well, then you could control. You could instill fear in the society. You get people to begin to self-censor because they don't want to sound. Nobody wants to sound like a radical extremist. I mean, listen, I call myself conservative. I believe in the principles of limited government. I believe in the idea that power should be in the people's hands in state and local government, that the federal government is way too massive, too bloated, and needs to be pared down. I believe in the Constitution. Those aren't conservative philosophies. I don't know why I call myself conservative. That's not supposed to be conservative principles. Those were supposed to be normal things that Americans unite around. Yet now that's far right ideology, according to our government. You want to fly a Betsy Ross flag. You want to fly an original flag of the United States. You just may be a terrorist because we don't like the things that people that have the Betsy Ross flag or the No Tread on Me flag, we don't like what they have to say. It's completely ridiculous, but they've been able to get away with it. And they're going to continue to get away with it because nobody's doing a damn thing about it.
I think we're also seeing them use it in a fashion right now where it's what's good for the goose is good for the gander. And I'm not on board for retribution. I mean, I was thinking about Douglas Mackey, who was an internet troll who played up the joke of Republicans vote on Tuesday, Democrats vote on Wednesday. And then the Biden administration, a week into coming into office, went after him for 5-year-old tweets. And the guy fought it all the way and eventually had the case tossed out. But then a few months ago, we had that Coast Guard sharpshooter, Peter Stinson, when he was called a sharpshooter because he passed a pistol qualification like in 1982 one time. And he was doing the exact same thing, it was represented to us threats, and everything he was saying was all First Amendment protected. He was a jerk, and he was saying, well, somebody needs to do something, but not me. And yet we had the Heritage Foundation come out and tag the FBI on X, and they spun up and arrested him for otherwise First Amendment protected activity. And recently we also saw the threats to Attorney General Bondi because somebody posted a sniper red dot on her head and said wanted dead or alive. Again, heated political rhetoric. Similarly, we had the teaching assistant in Illinois State University who knocked over the Turning Points USA table. That's a local crime, but the FBI had to get their fingers on that, got to get into that local crime. And they found out that he was saying things like, oh, well, somebody needs to take out the president. And then they interviewed him and he said, well, I don't have a gun and I don't believe in doing that. And they still arrested him for threats to the president.
Yeah, and there are morons in every society, right? You have to deal with them. And the reality is that many of these things, they may be distasteful. It may be ugly rhetoric that they're using. It may be stupid, like think before you post. But it doesn't necessarily mean it's an illegal action or these people actually represent a threat. But the threat term is used. And I look at it from the perspective where Democrats, they don't mind it, like I said, because right now it aided them, right? The weaponized system worked against Republicans, conservatives, people that uh, fell within that realm of political ideology. They don't realize how easy it could be turned around on them, and maybe now they get a hint of it. And I don't believe in retribution either. I want to see the structure dismantled. I don't want these powers to be used against the left, the right. To me, it is concerning that we've allowed it to get to this point. But it also shows you how there's a little authoritarianism in all of us, right? So in the United States, we constantly preach about this concept of liberty, that we want to be free. At the same time, we want to be little dictators. And I'll just give you one example. We look at Congress. Congress always has the lowest approval rating out of any branch of government. It usually approval rating hovers around anywhere from 13 to about 18%. And the number one reason people give for why they disapprove of the job Congress is doing is because they feel Congress doesn't do anything. Well, first of all, that's a beautiful thing. Just keep that in mind. Okay. That's what makes this system a great system. But secondly, people don't want Congress to do something. I mean, let's be honest about that. If you're a Democrat out there, you now have a Republican Congress. If a Republican Congress was passing law after law after law, it's not like all of a sudden you're going to approve of the job they're doing because they're doing something. You're going to say, no, I disapprove of them. I don't like the laws they're passing. You're only going to approve of Congress when they pass the laws that you want them to pass. The same holds true with executive orders, right? So I don't lie. I don't hide. I supported President Trump. I still support President Trump, certainly better than Kamala Harris by a million miles. But I don't like the executive orders. I am not a big fan of executive orders. Executive orders were never designed to change, modify, manipulate any types of laws. That's why we have Congress to do those things. Yet executive orders continue to push the boundaries. And there are two problems. When Democrats are in office, a Democrat president, and Republicans are there, people will complain Republicans obstruct a Democrat president. President Obama, President Biden should do things through executive order because Republicans are obstructing the agenda. Well, the reality of Congress is Congress exists to obstruct the presidency, to obstruct the executive branch. That's the whole point of Congress. And Republicans then fell into the trap after they complained about Obama or Biden using executive orders and, Congress being obstructionist. Well, they said, well, Trump should issue executive orders. And, Congress is obstructing him. And so let him do it. Well, no, that's the authoritarianism I'm talking about. And let's be honest here. Even if President Trump could issue executive orders, it doesn't solve the problem. It may put a band-aid on a few areas for the next 3 years, but those band-aids are easily ripped off. You need a permanent fix, not a temporary fix.
All right, let's get to that then. Let's get to some of the permanent fixes that you covered down on the PAS report, November 3rd. I think it was 5 bullet points that you had. I jotted them off to the side. Number 1 being power of the purse with attached to that strict defunding protocols. Can you kind of elaborate on that? And you think you had a great example with the IRS.
Yeah, this idea I love is when you have the control over the money supply in the United States, when you're the ones in Congress responsible for funding these agencies and departments, use that, wield it as a weapon. I mean, these agencies are supposed to be good stewards of our tax dollars. So, what I like to say is that Congress has to begin using this money. Any agency, any department that is caught abusing its power needs to have their funding stripped, bare bones, where they could only do whatever the agency mission is. So, for example, that I laid out was the IRS targeting of Tea Party groups. Now, Lois Lerner never faced accountability. But what Congress did was say, you, the IRS, you screwed up royally. You allowed the weaponization of non-taxable status to these organizations based on political ideology. We are now punishing you. We are now gutting your budget. And the IRS had to go bare bones for years, up until the Biden administration, unfortunately. They had to go bare bones. There were consequences to their actions. And they weren't able to hire people. So the power of the purse can change the behavior of the bureaucracy if you cut its funding. And the most important part of using the power of the purse is to make agencies justify every single activity they do. a lot of what Congress has done because of the continuing resolutions that, we're going to pass another one sooner, within a couple days or maybe a few weeks, is they don't even go line by line budgets anymore. They just give discretionary spending to these agencies, and these agencies could spend the money as they see fit. No, let these agencies justify every single penny they're getting. And if they are unable to justify their programs, if they're guilty of any type of abuses, you just cut off the funding stream, because the funding stream speaks volumes.
Sunset authorities, which I think we should have sunset authorities on all laws that are passed. I think that they should just go away or have to be reauthorized. I mean, they just kind of rubber stamp FISA, but I'd like to see that done with just about every law possible. But the sunset authorities for the agency powers and having to justify your existence. You want to lay that out, and then I do want to push on you on one concern that I have with it.
Yeah, well, I do believe that all laws should be sunsetted at some point, or at least reviewed. Okay. And I think that's the important. I understand we need laws. I understand that there are going to be things that are out of people's controls. There are going to be responsibilities that the government has to take on that we can't do ourselves. So I don't want to make it like I'm some anarchist, anti-government person. Okay. However, when we look at something like the Patriot Act, well, what happens when the threat of Al Qaeda goes away? How do you justify keeping those laws on the books, or even keeping a Department of Homeland Security? Well, you have to find new threats. And if you can't find new threats, well, then Congress could come in and say, well, what's the point of you? What's the point of your agency? What's the point of your department? Maybe we need to just get rid of it. So in order for these agencies to survive, they continually need this authority that's being granted by Congress. However, what Congress needs to do is create these sunsetting provisions. Your agency, here's the statutory authority, here's the powers you have. Well, now you need to come in every 5 years and justify the powers that we've given you. Now you need to come in every 5 years, justify the laws we have on the books. And if you are unable to do that, well, then the laws, the provisions will simply sunset. They'll simply go away. I mean, just a couple of years ago, Democrats introduced a bill to target domestic terrorism. And they would say that, well, the federal authorities were pushing for this bill. They wanted it passed to give them more power. We already have 50 statutes, over 50 statutes that could deal with domestic terrorism. So why do we need another law in the books? To me, you would need to be able to explain what those other 50 laws, dozens and dozens of laws, aren't doing. And you'd have to justify, well, why do you need these new powers? And if we're going to grant this new law, if we're going to pass it, well, then shouldn't we begin to repeal the previous laws? Well, why do they have to remain on the books? Why are we adding? And thankfully, it didn't pass. However, it gives you the mindset of these people. Let's just pass more laws, get more power, get more authority without ever reviewing the previous laws that are on the books and asking these agencies, well, why do you even need this power?
To me, there's no more greater example of how the bureaucratic mission creep comes in. You see the task force, like the Joint Terrorism Task Force. To me, a task force has stood up because Bonnie and Clyde are robbing banks and running across state lines, and we need to get a posse together and basically murder them in cold blood. And then once that's done, we break down the task force. The task was achieved. But when you have a terrorism task force, then they have to always exist, and they always have to be looking for threats. And the nature is that you look to work smarter, not harder. And that's where you don't find out people who are truly jihadists, who are hell-bent on bringing about political radical change, by instilling violence and fear into people. Instead, it's the idiots that are online spouting off, and we can build up a case and keep that going. Now, my concern for this is in the justifying your existence realm, and I think you maybe even addressed it with another one of your bullet points, was that when you have a justify your existence, it kind of incentivizes a quota system. You would have an agency come forward and say, look at all the good work we did arresting retards, and we're going to call them terrorists. But you don't know that. But I think if you marry it with another bullet point that you do have, which is the transparency element to it, where you would effectively have a full reporting of all the subpoenas and the search warrants that were issued, and that would just be open books to the people that were theoretically doing oversight, elected officials in Congress, then they wouldn't necessarily be able to hide that. You'd have a full audit, essentially, of what these agencies are doing, like an FBI and their counterterrorism program.
Yeah, I think you bring up a great point. And let's be honest, the bureaucracy knows how to manipulate things to make threats look far worse than they really are. I mean, just take the after 9/11. I would argue, now this is speculation on my part, and it's impossible to prove. I get that. People will criticize me, but I argue that if we simply reinforce the cockpit doors, enhance security at airports, we wouldn't have seen another 9/11 like incident. We didn't need the Patriot Act. We didn't need the Department of Homeland Security. I don't think there is a single person that would have gone on a plane and allowed someone to try and hijack that plane. I think that most passengers would get up and at this point, knowing what happened on 9/11, would beat the hell out of that person trying to hijack that plane. Yet we went into this overreaction. Again, people want to feel safe, and fear is the great motivator out there. But I would argue that, did the Patriot Act really stop any terror attacks? And I think that we could, raise that question. We saw some arrests. Don't get me wrong. We saw plots like trying to blow up the gas pipeline that runs from Newark to LaGuardia to JFK Airport. But would we have found that out anyway during with normal investigative tools as opposed to the Patriot Act and all this now pre-crime? We want to interdict before a crime even happens and try and predict crime, which is nearly impossible. I mean, listen, the reality is that, again, we're a free society, and so we are going to take on risks. And throughout the 1990s, there were a couple of terror attacks, but we also thwarted a lot of plots, and they didn't need new powers. In fact, on 9/11, all the evidence was there. It was just that the agencies didn't speak to each other because they weren't allowed to. There was that wall of silence, and agencies with their egos wanted to keep information to themselves. But the information was there that a terror attack was going to happen. If we put together the pieces of the puzzle, we would have been able to stop it. And things are naturally, these are fallible people. As far as transparency goes, yes, I do believe that agencies will lie and manipulate to justify their existence. They'll inflate the numbers. First of all, we got to get rid of this idea of government bureaucrats getting friggin' bonuses. I don't know what the hell is up with that. But no government bureaucrat should get a bonus based on how many investigations have begun. I mean, that incentive alone is a great abuse of power. And we have to look at that. Government civil servants are supposed to do the job, not because they're going to get great pay and great rewards. They're supposed to do the job because they have a belief in the community that they're doing something to strengthen their country, to improve their country, not to become rich. And far too many government bureaucrats have become rich. It's ridiculous. And we do have to have a need to know what these agencies are doing. What are you constituting as an investigation? I mean, I think you were the one that told me when it came to counterterrorism investigations or whatnot, you know, January 6th would have been looked at as one incident. Instead, they opened up thousands of incidents to make the numbers inflated, to make the threat look much greater than it really was. And yet we all know January 6th was a few hours, one incident, one day. People got out of control, and that was it. It ended. There was no insurrection. There was no overthrow of government. There were no repeated sustained attacks against the government. It wasn't a rebellion. It was some people made poor choices. Other people simply were just on the grounds. They should have been maybe issued trespassing citations, if that, because it's our tax dollars. These are our grounds. But the reality, they opened up thousands of cases to inflate the numbers. And to me, that's where Congress is important. That's where the inspector generals are important, to keep these agencies honest to as great as a degree you can. I never trust any government agency. And, we said perfection in government should never go in a sentence. Honest in government should also never go in a sentence together, especially when you're talking to bureaucrats. But again, we have to do our part to make sure that they're being honest, to make sure if there isn't a threat, yeah, let's talk about restructuring Homeland Security and paring it down. And I understand that there are people that try and justify because they don't want to lose their livelihoods. But at the same time, why do we keep on empowering a beast that has proven that it's going to abuse us? They're worried about Trump becoming a dictator, and Republicans worry about communism coming to the United States. Worry about the bureaucracy, a fourth branch of government that's unencumbered from the Constitution. When America becomes authoritarian, it's not going to be because of the political parties. It's going to be because of people like James Comey that staff our government. That's what it's going to be.
And I mean, along the lines of January 6th, it seems to me that the government was part of preserving the narrative, and borrow Nancy Pelosi's phrase, because they married a pipe bomb, which there is now strong indication of that it was a government actor involved with that, with the events at the Capitol, even though there's never actually been any evidence tying one to the other. They, in fact, even in the charging documents or in sentencing recommendations for people who were just parading through the Capitol, they were mentioning a pipe bomb, again, which wasn't connected at all because they wanted the terrorism enhancement. I mean, that's a great example
Well,
of.
and that should show that this isn't a Republican or a Democrat issue, right? I mean, Republicans are now in charge. Kash Patel's at the FBI. I don't know what the hell he's doing at the FBI, but he's the one in charge of the FBI. And when we look at things like that, right, we still know very little about this pipe bomber. It doesn't make any sense. And then we learn what 380 agents were there and plain clothes. We got to make sure that they're plain clothes. They weren't undercover. And he says they were there for what? Crowd control, crowd protection. Like
No.
when you went through your FBI training, did they ever train you on crowd control? I mean, that's a local government function, local police forces. You know, you could bring in National Guard for riot control. They do actually have some training in riot control that I've done with exercises with the National Guard units. But the FBI to say that over 200 agents were there in plain clothes for crowd control is just the dumbest thing I've ever heard. And so we're still being lied to. And I think that the testimony that I forget her name, she was the deputy for counterterrorism or whatever. She was testifying Ted Cruz was asking her a question, Senator Ted Cruz, did the FBI have assets on the ground? Did the FBI have informants on the ground? Did they have any agents on the ground? Did those agents engage in any type of violent activity? Did they commit any crimes? Did they encourage others to commit any crimes? And every answer she gave was, I can't answer that question. I'm not going to answer that question. So we all know what the answer is. It's not a secret. But again, there's an example of Congress holding a public hearing. We see that, and then nothing happens after that. And, I don't care about Comey getting arrested and potentially going to jail or John Bolton or whoever. That's great. Accountability is important. If these people violated the law, they're innocent until proven guilty. But if they violated the law, put them on trial. Hopefully they're convicted. Hopefully they go to jail for a very long period of time. They should never be close to power ever again. But at the same time, that does not fix the problem because the mindset of the bureaucrats still exists.
I mean, theoretically, the Republicans control the Department of Justice, control the FBI, and there's a lot of blacked out names in the Arctic Frost files. Those are all people who
Correct.
still work for the agency, which is wholly inappropriate. If they were certainly engaging in an activity that was, we'll say, less than honest, I mean, it might be a predicated investigation, but if they lacked integrity, why are they not being exposed?
Absolutely. And this is another problem with Congress. I mean, years ago, they should have actually introduced legislation about redactions because the redactions are out of control at this point. I mean, I remember Andrew McCabe, he was the deputy FBI director. They redacted that he ordered a $60,000 conference table for the FBI. I mean, first of all, any bureaucrat that orders a friggin' $60,000 table deserves to be slapped. I'm sorry, tar and feather that person. They should have to go to IKEA and put it together themselves. That's the type of furniture they should have to use. This is our tax dollars. But they redacted it because it was embarrassing. So Congress, again, has a role to play in this. Pass a law that you can't use redactions for all these things. Why is it? Well, it's not national security information, but it's sensitive information and it's official information that can't be revealed to the public. Well, why can't I know the name of a bureaucrat that abused their power that's still working within that agency, still working in that department? It's completely ludicrous.
Mm-hmm. You hit on physically removing so much of the bureaucracies from Washington, D.C. and spreading them around. And I think that makes a lot of sense. But I want to focus in on the final point that you had about rewriting laws and clearly defining the authorities that these agencies and departments actually have and attaching some personal liability, like no more qualified immunity for these people. Can you just go into that for us here?
Yes, qualified immunity, I think, is the most important thing. So when we look at it, Democrats strip police officers, local police officers in many major cities of qualified immunity, meaning that if anything happens when a police officer is on the job, whether they're in pursuit of a suspect, anything goes sideways, well, now that police officer could be held personally liable and they could be sued personally and have their livelihood destroyed. Well, if we could strip qualified immunity from police officers, which we never should have done, I don't like what Democrats did, but if we could strip qualified immunity from police officers, why can't we strip qualified immunity from federal agents? Where if you have, 25 federal agents kicking in the door of a 70 something year old man in Roger Stone with a SWAT team when he would have just came down to FBI, the local field office with his lawyer and turned himself in. Well, Roger Stone should be able to sue those federal agents, the trauma that he suffered during that raid. And I think taking away qualified immunity and FBI is monitoring people going into churches. Well, the churches should be able to sue the FBI. They're not domestic violent extremists. There's no evidence of domestic violent extremism. And it is libel and slander against them. So I say get rid of qualified immunity for federal bureaucrats. And we should get rid of qualified immunity for members of Congress, too. I also believe that we do need to look at these agencies and what is their actual statutory authority. So take the FBI, for instance. The FBI, created as an investigatory agency, it's abused its power throughout its history. They've done good things as well. I'm not totally slamming the FBI, but the FBI has great tools that could assist state and local governments, that could assist state and local police departments when it comes to forensics. Okay, if they're good at that, then why do they need all those other powers? They're not good at intelligence. I could assure you on that. They're not good in finding real threats. So make them one of those agencies that assist state and local governments. They don't need to get involved in all these different areas. Most crimes committed, as I said before, are state and local crimes. And I could go agency by agency, Department of Homeland Security. Focus more on the emergency management aspect, the natural disaster aspect. Get out of the intelligence component.
Lost you there for a second, Nick. Go ahead.
Oh, so, with any agency or department, we look at the statutory authority. A lot of it is vague. It needs to be more specific. It needs to force them into a box where here is your mission. That's what you could do. And if you step outside the boundaries of that, we revoke your statutory authority, period. And that's it.
I think that all those make a ton of sense, but we're also dealing with people who theoretically have the power to do it, and for whatever their motivations are not inclined to do it. Last thing that I want to throw at you: how do we get them to do what we need them to do?
Well, that's the biggest question of all, right? I mean, the American people have become apathetic. The American people have their heads buried in the sand, and far too many of the American people don't care what the government does. They don't care about the abuses of power, and they're not going to care until it directly impacts their life. And that's the problem throughout history. We've seen governments that start out free, they grow more and more abusive. All the signs and the evidence is there. And then all of a sudden you wake up, you're in an authoritarian society. People are like, wait, how did this happen? We don't like this. But now it's too late. There's nothing you can do about it. And part of the problem, what concerns me the most out of all this is not necessarily the bureaucrats. They terrify me, but not as much as the people do. They don't get involved. They don't get active. And they were never educated on the United States. Like, they have no idea of why government exists. They don't know the roles and responsibilities of our institutions. We've seen problems get elevated to the federal level. Meanwhile, it's a local government responsibility. And everyone looks to the government to solve problems. And, even if we look back to what the mayor's race here in New York City, Mamdani, given his victory speech, he stated, quote, "There is no problem too big that the government can't solve, and no issue too small that the government can't look at." And that should terrify every single American, because the government doesn't solve problems. In fact, I could easily argue and show with evidence that the government actually creates problems. And then it seeks the power to solve the problems that it created, and it never solves the problems anyway. And I just think it's time to defang this beast.
It's a dog chasing its tail, and that's probably the most benign and innocent explanation that I can give it. So Nick, I really appreciate you coming on and joining me today and helping to noodle these issues out with me. I think that your recommendations are spot on. I want to make sure that I plug your podcast as well. If you want to just take a moment, where can folks find everything that you're doing?
Sure. Everyone can check out the PAS Report podcast. In addition to the interview segments and my monologues, I also released the America's Founding series on the podcast, where I talk about forgotten patriots that helped create this nation, that helped found this country, and to try and get Americans to understand what the American identity is all about: liberty, freedom, self-reliance, American grit, limited government, self-governance. These are all important concepts that Americans have abandoned long ago. And you could also go to the PAS Report website, pasreport.com, or find me on social media at PAS Report, where, I'll put my thoughts out there. And I just wanted to let people know I am not here to validate your opinions. I love when I get like blowback from other Republicans and conservatives like, hey, no, I'm not here to validate anyone's opinions. I'm here to call it the way I see it. And some people love that. Other people, not so much.
You're a far more artful way of saying, this is not your mama's show. This is your daddy's show. All right. Hey, man, I thank you again. I'm definitely going to have you back on this one. And I want to make sure that I thank the audience for joining us today on rumble.com/amradpod and on the YouTube, the American Radicals Podcast, iTunes, Spotify, iHeart, at X America News. As always, plan to be back with you if the voice is here on Saturday, 10:30 Eastern time. And until then, guys, have a great day.
You've been listening to the voice of the Suspendables on the American Radicals podcast. Follow us on rumble.com/amradpod.